Black woman kicked off first class. The pilot walked out and did the unthinkable. Atlanta International Airport buzzed with the usual flurry of travelers and flight announcements echoing off the high ceilings. Tianna Brooks walked confidently toward Gate 7, clutching her boarding pass for Flight 262 to New York. She was dressed in a smart navy blue blazer, jeans and flats, comfortable, understated, but neat. Her hair was pulled back in a curly bun, and she carried a worn leather satchel over her shoulder. The flight attendant at the gate scanned her pass, glanced at the seat number, then at Tianna's face with a flicker of hesitation. "First class is to your left," the attendant said flatly, as if the information was somehow unexpected. Tianna nodded with a polite smile and made her way on board. Inside the aircraft, she stepped into the plush carpet of the first-class cabin, located just before the divider to economy. She paused at seat 2A, checked the number again, and then carefully placed her bag in the overhead compartment. As she sat down, a middle-aged white man 2 seats over leaned toward the aisle and called out, "Excuse me, miss. I think you're in the wrong cabin." Tianna looked up. "No, I'm not. This is seat 2A. Before she could say more, a white flight attendant approached. She had the kind of clipped professionalism that was always one breath away from condescension. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass again?" Tianna calmly retrieved her phone and showed the digital ticket. The attendant's smile didn't reach her eyes. Just a moment." She disappeared toward the front, and a few awkward seconds passed. The man beside Tianna muttered under his breath, "They'll figure it out." When the attendant returned, she stood firm. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the cabin for a moment. There seems to be an issue with your seat." Tianna furrowed her brow. "There's no issue. That's my seat, and I have the ticket to prove it." "I'm not asking again," the attendant said, her voice lower now, colder. Others in the cabin watched, eyes flicking back and forth, but no one spoke. A young Asian-American couple in the last row of first class exchanged glances. The woman whispered, "That doesn't look right," but stayed silent. Moments later, 2 airport security staff arrived. They didn't ask questions, just stood there, stiff and expectant. Tianna stood slowly. Her voice was calm but firm. "You're making a mistake. I belong here." One of the guards gestured toward the door. "Ma'am, let's take this outside." As she stepped into the aisle, she caught sight of a man standing at the cockpit door, tall, in uniform, with 4 stripes on his shoulders. He had just emerged, his brows furrowed, and his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before him. The pilot's eyes scanned the passengers, the staff, and finally locked onto Tianna, with a look that could only be described as thunderous. He stepped out of the cockpit, and everything went silent. As the murmurs faded behind her, and the chill of humiliation clung to her like a second skin, Tianna Brooks sat in a quiet corner of the terminal. Her shoulders were still squared, but her eyes had dulled, not with shame but with weariness. Not again, she thought. Not after everything. Her fingers tightened around her satchel, and for a moment she let herself drift back. There was a time when first class meant something very different, something far removed from airplane seats and complimentary champagne. It meant being the first in her family to graduate high school, the first to go to college, the first to speak on a stage, and be heard by thousands. But before any of that, it meant surviving. It meant growing up on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where opportunity was a rumor and police sirens sang lullabies. Her mother had worked 2 jobs, one as a janitor, the other cleaning, offices at night. They didn't have a home for a time, just a beat-up Honda Civic with a back seat that Tianna used as a bed and a front seat for homework. She remembered balancing textbooks on her knees by the flickering streetlight outside, the library parking lot, eating crackers with ketchup packets, pretending it was spaghetti. Tianna wasn't a prodigy. She wasn't some overnight success. She was the girl who got straight A's and was told by her guidance counselor to be realistic about college. The girl who applied to 10 universities and got 9 rejections. The girl who walked to community college when the bus fare ran out. Who juggled 3 part-time jobs. Who got called aggressive when she asked to be treated equally. She remembered the sting of her first job interview after graduate school. A position in a prestigious university. The panel nodded through her presentation, smiled politely, and asked if she had experience working with diverse populations. She was black. That was her experience. She didn't get the job, but she didn't. Quit, Tianna earned her PhD in sociology with a focus on racial equity and systemic injustice. She began teaching. Her classes filled up with students who had never seen a professor who looked like her. She became a TEDx speaker. Her talk, more than a statistic, went viral. She traveled, she taught, she challenged. She opened doors for others, young women especially, who had been told they were too loud, too poor, too dark, too much. And now she was on her way to New York to receive the National Inspiration Award, a ceremony that would be aired on national television, recognizing leaders who had changed the social fabric of America. That was why she bought the first-class ticket. Not for luxury, not for status, but because she had earned it. Every step of her journey, every night in that car, every rejection letter, every speech she delivered to rooms full of people who didn't want to listen, brought her to seat 2A. First class wasn't a seat. It was a journey, and Tianna had paid for it with far more than a credit card. She straightened, the fire in her eyes returning. She had been humiliated, yes, but she was not broken. She would not allow this moment, this petty, ignorant moment, to define her. Across the terminal, she noticed the captain again. He was standing stiffly, arms folded, speaking in hushed tones with an airline supervisor. His face was unreadable, but his eyes kept glancing toward her. Something was happening. Tianna exhaled, steadying herself. Whatever came next, she would not lower her gaze. Because she didn't just deserve to be in first class. She deserved to be seen. Back on board the aircraft, tension hung in the cabin like static before a lightning strike. Captain Harris stepped out from the cockpit, his uniform crisp, his jaw clenched. He wasn't a man easily rattled. Decades of flying had taught him how to stay composed through turbulence, both in the sky and on the ground. He approached the lead flight attendant, Rebecca, who stiffened at the sight of him. "What just happened here?" he asked, voice low but firm. Rebecca straightened her posture and clasped her hands. "Sir, there was a passenger in first class causing a disturbance. She refused to comply when asked to verify her seat." "Was she violent?" he asked. "No, sir." "Threatening?" "No." "Then why was she removed?" Harris's tone sharpened. "She didn't seem like—" Rebecca hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She didn't respond appropriately. I believed she was in the wrong cabin. There was confusion." Harris narrowed his eyes. "You believed? Did you check her boarding pass?" "I asked her to step outside so we could clear it up. With security." He finished the sentence for her, and there was no hiding the judgment in his voice. She refused to cooperate. "Or maybe," he said, "she just didn't want to be humiliated." Passengers nearby had begun to listen, eyes tracking the conversation. A man in business attire at 3B shook his head subtly. The young Asian-American couple from earlier exchanged glances again. The woman leaned toward the aisle and raised her phone, hitting record. "Excuse me," she called out quietly. "That woman, she wasn't causing any trouble. She had her ticket. We saw it." A few rows behind her, someone else chimed in. "Yeah, this doesn't feel right. She wasn't even loud." Captain Harris took a slow breath. Years in the cockpit had taught him to trust his instincts, and his gut was screaming that something deeply wrong had just happened. He turned to Rebecca. "What's her name?" She looked flustered. "Tianna Brooks, I think." Without another word, Harris turned and headed down the jet bridge, leaving the stunned crew behind. He moved with purpose, bypassing gate agents and pushing open the glass door into the airport's side corridor. Inside the operations office, he found a junior supervisor and 2 security guards standing near the door. They looked up as he approached. "I need to speak with Ms. Tianna Brooks," he said. The supervisor hesitated. "She's in the holding lounge. We were just—" "Now," Harris cut in. They led him to a small waiting room near the concourse, where Tianna sat with her bag in her lap, posture poised but eyes wary. Her dignity hadn't left her, but fatigue clung to her like a second skin. She looked up when he entered. Recognition flickered across her face. He wasn't just the captain, he had watched it all unfold. Captain Harris stepped forward, stopping a few feet in front of her. Around them, the room stilled. "Ms. Brooks," he said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Do you still have your boarding pass?" She nodded slowly, reaching into her bag and holding up the digital ticket on her phone. "Good," he said, his eyes locked onto hers. "Because this plane isn't leaving the ground unless you're back on it." The room went silent. The supervisor's mouth opened slightly. One of the guards blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. Even Tianna sat frozen, the words sinking in. Captain Harris didn't blink. His voice was calm, but immovable. "I won't fly for a company that lets dignity get downgraded." Tianna sat still for a long moment, the weight of Captain Harris's words settling into her chest. She looked down at her phone, her boarding pass glowing faintly in her hand, and then back at him. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," she said softly, "but I don't want to make this any bigger than it already is. I'm used to walking away. It's easier." Captain Harris crouched slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I know it's easier, but easier isn't always right. And walking away? That's what they count on. Silence doesn't keep the peace. It just keeps the problem hidden." He straightened, his eyes unwavering. "If we don't speak now, this happens to someone else tomorrow. Maybe someone younger. Maybe someone who can't carry it like you can." Tianna's throat tightened. For a second, she couldn't speak. Then Harris turned toward the glass doors that led back to the terminal. With a calmness that was louder than any shout, he pushed them open and walked into the central seating area. Dozens of passengers still, lingering nearby, murmuring, watching the unfolding drama. He climbed onto a small bench just beside the gate's main counter. All eyes turned to him. Security tensed. Phones were already recording. "My name is Captain Paul Harris," he began, his voice carrying across the concourse, "and I am the commanding pilot of Flight 262 to New York City." A hush fell over the crowd. A few minutes ago, a paying passenger, Tianna Brooks, was removed from this flight despite having a valid first-class ticket. She was not disruptive. She was not aggressive. She was only questioned because of how she looked. Whispers erupted across the floor. Someone in the back clapped. Another shouted, "Say it!" Harris raised his hand. "I am not making a political statement," he said. "I am making a professional one. Every passenger, regardless of color, class, or clothing, deserves the same respect. And if Ms. Brooks is not welcomed aboard this aircraft, like any other first-class passenger, I will not fly this plane." The silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was reverent. It was the kind of silence that comes before something shifts. A few scattered claps grew into a round of applause. A middle-aged woman near the front wiped tears from her eyes. A college student lifted his phone to stream live. Someone called out, "About time!" Back near the gate desk, a senior airport official, clearly called in during the escalation, stepped forward, his expression tight. "Captain, may I speak to you privately?" Harris didn't flinch. "No need. The matter's simple. Either we fix this now, or we ground the plane." The man sighed. Then, with visible reluctance, he turned to Tianna, still seated by the wall. "Ms. Brooks," he said stiffly, "on behalf of the airline, I apologize for the misunderstanding. We'd like to personally invite you back aboard." Tianna stood slowly, the eyes of dozens of passengers following her every move. Her heart raced, but it wasn't from fear this time. It was from a fire reigniting. Captain Harris walked with her side by side, back toward Gate 7. As they entered the jet bridge again, the whispers started. A few passengers in economy smiled at her. Some gave small nods. Others simply moved aside, making room for her to pass. When she reached first class, her seat, 2A, was waiting. Rebecca, the flight attendant who had started it all, was no longer at the front of the cabin. In her place stood a new crew member, face composed, voice gentle. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Brooks," she said. "May I help you with your bag?" Tianna nodded, speechless for a moment. Then, reclaiming her seat, she sat down, this time not with caution, but with quiet power. Moments later, the intercom buzzed. "This is your captain speaking," Harris said, his voice steady across the speaker system. "Today's flight will depart shortly. But before we begin our journey, I have one reminder for everyone on board." A pause. A silence full of anticipation. "We can't fly if we're still carrying the weight of prejudice. That gravity keeps us grounded more than any storm ever could. Let's leave it behind, today and every day after." The plane erupted in applause, but Tianna, sitting upright in 2A, simply closed her eyes, exhaled deeply, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was boarding a plane. She felt like she was rising. At 35,000 feet. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engines and the occasional clink of cutlery against porcelain. But something had shifted. Something deeper than altitude or pressure. There was a reverence in the air, a hush not born of fear or fatigue, but of shared recognition. The passengers weren't just on a flight anymore. They were witnessing a moment. Tianna sat by the window in seat 2A, staring out at the vast sky beyond. Clouds unfurled like silk beneath the wings. Her reflection on the glass was calm, but her thoughts moved like thunder just beneath the surface. She was still processing. Not the humiliation, not even the apology, but the weight of having been seen, truly seen for once, not in spite of who she was, but because of it. A soft tap on her shoulder broke her reverie. She turned to see the young Asian American woman from earlier. She smiled nervously and handed Tianna a folded slip of paper before returning to her seat without a word. Tianna opened it slowly. "Thank you for standing your ground. You didn't just board the plane for yourself. You boarded it for all of us." Tianna's throat tightened. Behind her, the murmur of conversation resumed. A man nearby was whispering, "Have you seen it online yet?" Across the aisle, someone gasped, "It's everywhere." And it was. In real time, footage of the captain's public statement had been uploaded. First to TikTok, then to Instagram, then everywhere. Hashtags began to trend before the plane even touched down. Wings of respect. Fly fair. Tianna Brooks, pilot of justice. News outlets picked it up. Activist groups reposted it. Celebrities retweeted it. Airlines scrambled to prepare statements. But none of it meant more than the moment Tianna stood again, this time on a different kind of stage. 2 days later, she stood behind a podium in New York, draped in a navy gown, a glass trophy in hand. The lights of the auditorium warmed her skin, but the warmth came from within. The applause had faded now, and all eyes were on her as she took a breath. "I never imagined a moment of injustice, so familiar to so many of us, would lead me here," she began. "I wasn't the loudest voice that day. I didn't stage a protest. I didn't even plan to speak up. But I did what I've done my whole life. I stayed seated in the truth." She scanned the room. And a man with the power to fly chose to walk for justice. The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. "We don't always get to pick the sky we fly through," she said, "but we can decide what kind of wings we use." She held up the trophy, then lowered it gently. "In this life, we don't need to fly higher. We just need to fly fair. A standing ovation followed, not just of admiration, but of awakening. Across the country, millions watched that clip. And in one small living room in Mississippi, a little black boy, no older than 7, sat cross-legged in front of a flickering television screen. His eyes were wide with wonder. He tugged on his mother's sleeve, voice filled with quiet hope. "Mama," he asked, "can I be a pilot one day?" His mother looked down at him, eyes misty. She brushed his cheek gently and smiled. "You can be whatever your heart flies toward, baby." Because justice, when it lifts even one soul, gives wings to 1,000 others, and every act of fairness today becomes the wind beneath justice tomorrow. Thank you for listening to today's story. Remember, every time we stand up for what's right, on the ground or in the skies, we help the world rise a little higher. See you in the next story.